the night it happened still haunts me. The stars had been scattered across the sky like shards of broken glass, cold and distant, just as the war between our people and the invaders had left our world. The battle was raging around us, explosions lighting up the sky as we stood at the edge of a ruined city, watching the enemy forces close in. We both knew what was coming, and there wasn't enough time for both of us to escape. Zane stood beside me, his face calm despite the chaos. I had known him for years. He had always been there, quiet, steady, my closest friend. I didn't realize how deeply he cared for me until that night. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice low but resolute. "No," I protested, grabbing his arm. "We can make it together. We'll find another way." "There's no time, Lyra," he replied, his eyes locking onto mine. "One of us has to stay behind, or neither of us will make it." I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him, but I also knew he was right. We were outnumbered, and the enemy forces were too close. Zane smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and then he said the words that would stay with me forever. "I'm doing this for you. In the next life, maybe things will be different. Maybe then, you'll love me the way I've always loved you." Before I could respond, he was gone, charging toward the enemy, his sword drawn, his form disappearing into the chaos. I wanted to follow him, to fight by his side, but my feet were frozen, and deep down, I knew that this was his choice. Zane had made the ultimate sacrifice, hoping that in another life, things would be different. Years passed, and I thought the pain of losing him would fade, but it never did. I could still see him, still hear his voice in my mind, but life went on, as it always does, and eventually, the war ended. I grew older, the scars of the past healing only on the surface, but every time I looked up at the night sky, I thought of Zane and his final words. Then, something I had never imagined happened. I woke up one day, in a world that wasn't my own. It was as if I had been reborn. My body, my surroundings, everything was different, but the strangest part was that my memories were intact. I remembered everything: the war, Zane, his sacrifice, and as I tried to make sense of what had happened, it hit me: this was the next life Zane had spoken of. My heart raced with hope. If I had been reborn, then Zane must have been too. The universe had given us another chance. This time, things could be different. This time, I wouldn't make the same mistake. I spent weeks searching for him, knowing in my heart that he was out there somewhere, and finally, I found him. He was standing by a marketplace, surrounded by people, looking just as he had in our past life: strong, steady, and unassuming. My breath caught in my throat as I approached him, my heart pounding with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "Zane," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. He turned, his eyes meeting mine. For a brief moment, I saw recognition flicker in his gaze, and my heart soared. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. His expression became cold, distant. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Do I know you?" I stared at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was Zane, the man who had given his life for me, the man who had loved me enough to sacrifice everything in the hope of another chance. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized with growing horror that he didn't remember me. He didn't remember anything. "It's me, Lyra," I stammered. "You sacrificed yourself for me, hoping we'd find each other again in this life." Zane frowned, shaking his head. "I think you must be mistaken. I don't know what you're talking about." My heart shattered. How could this be happening? He had died for me, given everything for me, and now, in this new life, he didn't even remember. Worse than that, there was no trace of the love he had once felt for me. I tried to explain, tried to make him remember, but every word I said only seemed to push him further away. He was polite, but distant, treating me like a stranger. The more I talked, the more it became clear this Zane was not the same man who had loved me in the past life. He had moved on. He didn't care. Weeks turned into months, and no matter how hard I tried, Zane remained indifferent. It was as if the connection we had once shared had been erased from his soul. The man who had given everything for me was gone, and in his place was someone who barely acknowledged my existence. I couldn't understand it. How could the universe be so cruel? I had spent years grieving his loss, regretting that I hadn't loved him when I had the chance, and now, when I was finally ready to love him, he no longer cared. There were moments, though, when I caught glimpses of the Zane I had known. Sometimes, I would see him staring off into the distance, a strange look in his eyes, as if he was trying to remember something just out of reach. But whenever I approached him, the moment would pass, and he would turn away, his expression unreadable. I started to wonder if it was my fault. Had I waited too long? Had I missed my chance in the last life? And now, in this one, the universe was punishing me for it? The thought gnawed at me, leaving me hollow and broken. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself walking through the city, my thoughts consumed by Zane and the life we had once shared. I ended up in the same marketplace where I had first found him in this new life, standing in the exact spot where he had looked at me with cold, unfamiliar eyes. The marketplace was empty now, the stars shining brightly overhead, just as they had the night Zane had sacrificed himself for me. I closed my eyes, trying to remember the way things had been, trying to hold on to the love that had once been between us. "You're still thinking about him?" The voice startled me, and I turned to see a stranger standing nearby, watching me with an expression of quiet understanding. He was older, with silver hair and kind eyes, and something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you're still clinging to something that's already gone." I frowned, my chest tightening. "I don't understand. Zane, he died for me. He gave everything, hoping we'd find each other again. And now..." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sympathy. "Sometimes, love isn't meant to last forever, even if it spans lifetimes. Zane made his choice, and now, in this life, you have to make yours." But moving on wasn't easy. I found myself avoiding Zane. Every time I saw him, it was a reminder of the man I had once loved and the man he no longer was. Each encounter was like tearing open a wound that had barely started to heal, and though he remained polite, there was a cold distance between us that I couldn't bridge. It wasn't his fault, I reminded myself. He didn't know what we had shared, and perhaps it was for the best. Still, the pain lingered, a constant ache in my chest. Weeks passed, and I buried myself in the new world we lived in. It was a strange existence, peaceful and quiet compared to the war-torn life we had left behind. I found work as a teacher in a small town, trying to build a life for myself, one that didn't revolve around Zane, and slowly, little by little, I began to heal. But Zane was never far from my thoughts, even though I tried to move on. There were nights when I would dream of him, dreams of our past life, of the battles we had fought together, of the night he had died. In those dreams, he was always the same, kind, brave, and full of love for me. I would wake up with tears in my eyes, only to remember that the man in my dreams no longer existed. One evening, months after I had last seen him, I found myself drawn back to the marketplace where we had first reunited in this new life. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling overhead, and the air was cool with the scent of flowers from the nearby gardens. I stood in the exact spot where I had once stood, my heart heavy with the memories of everything that had happened since. As I stared up at the stars, lost in thought, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I froze. It was Zane. He stood a few feet away, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His usual cold demeanor was gone, replaced by something softer, almost conflicted. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to walk away, to avoid the pain of seeing him again. But another part of me, perhaps the part that still held on to hope, kept me rooted in place. "I come here sometimes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's familiar." Zane nodded, stepping closer. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze drifting to the sky, "about what you said, about our past life." My heart skipped a beat. Had he remembered? Was it possible that, after all this time, he had started to recall the bond we had once shared? "I don't remember everything," he continued, his brow furrowed as if he was struggling to piece together a puzzle. "But there's something, a feeling, maybe, like there's more to all of this than I can understand." Hope flared in my chest, and I took a step toward him. "Zane, He held up a hand, stopping me. "I don't know if I'll ever remember what we had," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but I do know that I'm not the same person I was back then. And you're holding on to someone who no longer exists." His words cut through me like a blade, but I knew he was right. The Zane who had loved me, who had died for me, was gone, and the man standing before me now was a stranger, someone with his own path, his own life. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I wish I could be the person you remember, but I can't." I blinked back the tears that threatened to fall, nodding as I struggled to find my voice. "I understand," I whispered, my heart breaking all over again. "I've been holding on to a memory, and that's not fair to either of us." Zane hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say more, but instead, he simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, Lyra," he said quietly, before turning and walking away. I watched him go, my chest tight with emotion. This time, I didn't call out to him, I didn't try to stop him, I stood there, letting him go, just as I knew I had to. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life without Zane in it. The pain of losing him again was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the sharp, overwhelming grief that had consumed me before. Instead, it was a quiet ache, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. I thought of the stranger's words, the man who had told me to let go. He had been right. Sometimes, love isn't meant to last forever, even if it spans lifetimes, and perhaps that was the hardest lesson to learn, that not every story ends the way we hope. But as I continued to move forward, I realized that letting go didn't mean forgetting. Zane would always be a part of me, a piece of my heart that I carried with me, no matter where life took me, and though he no longer loved me, and I no longer clung to the past, I could still cherish the memories of the man he had once been. One evening, as I sat by the window of my small cottage, watching the sun set over the hills, I found myself smiling for the first time in a long while. It was a bittersweet smile, tinged with both sadness and acceptance, but it was genuine. I had loved Zane in another life, and in this life, I had learned to love myself enough to let go. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "But I love him, I can't just let go." The man stepped closer, his gaze gentle but firm. "Maybe that's exactly what you need to do. Let go. You've been given a second chance, but that doesn't mean the past will repeat itself. It's up to you to decide what to do with this new life." For a long time, I stood there in silence, the man's words echoing in my mind, and as I looked up at the stars, I realized that maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't about Zane anymore, maybe it was about me. In the end, love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to let go. Letting go. The words echoed in my mind as I stood in the empty marketplace, staring up at the stars. How could I let go of someone who had meant so much to me? Someone who had sacrificed his life in the hope that we'd have another chance? Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that clinging to the past was only hurting me. Zane had moved on, whether by choice or fate, and now it was my turn.
Months passed, and life began to settle into something that felt peaceful. It was strange at first, the quiet, the absence of the constant ache that had once accompanied every thought of Zane. But as time went on, I grew more comfortable in the silence. My days became routine at teaching at the school, walking through the town, enjoying the simplicity of this new life. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I still thought about him, of course. How could I not? Zane had left an indelible mark on me, not just in this life, but in the one we had left behind. There were nights when I would lie awake, wondering what he was doing, if he had found peace, if he had discovered the happiness that eluded us both. But I no longer felt the overwhelming need to chase after him. I no longer held on to the hope that one day he might remember and come back to me. I had learned to live with the truth. Some things, no matter how much you want them, are never meant to be. It was a lesson I carried with me every day, one that had helped me find my footing in this new life. I threw myself into my work, spending more time with the students, investing in their futures and their dreams, watching them grow. Seeing the wonder in their eyes as they learned something new gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't known I needed. It was fulfilling in a way that I hadn't expected, a way that made me feel whole again. One afternoon, as I was packing up my things at the school, I heard a soft knock at the door. I turned, expecting to see one of the students who had forgotten something, but instead, my heart skipped a beat. It was Zane. He stood in the doorway, looking uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. It had been so long since I had seen him, and yet, in that instant, it felt like no time had passed at all. "Zane," I breathed, surprised by the sudden rush of emotion that surged through me. What are you doing here? He hesitated, shifting awkwardly on his feet before stepping inside. I wanted to talk, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of something unsaid. I nodded, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing, though I wasn't sure why. What is it? He didn't speak right away. Instead, he glanced around the room, his brow furrowed, as if searching for the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked back at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected: regret. I've been thinking about what you said, Zane began, his voice low, about our past life, about everything. I frowned, my breath catching in my throat. This was the conversation I had once dreamed of having, the conversation I had convinced myself would never happen. What do you mean? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to put his thoughts into words. I didn't understand it at first. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized there's something I've been missing, something I couldn't remember. My heart pounded in my chest, hope flickering to life even though I had promised myself I wouldn't let it. Do you remember? Zane looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the weight of the memories returning to him. He nodded slowly. Not everything, he admitted, but enough. Enough to know that you were telling the truth. Enough to know that I loved you once. The words hit me like a wave, and I had to steady myself to keep from being overwhelmed. After all this time, after everything, he finally remembered. The man I had loved, the man who had given his life for me, was standing before me again. But even as the realization sank in, I knew something was different. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he held himself. The love we had shared in the past life was there, but it was distant, like a memory he couldn't fully grasp. And now, I asked softly, afraid of the answer but needing to hear it all the same. Zane's gaze softened, and he looked at me with a sadness that mirrored my own. Nah, I'm not the same person I was back then, he said gently. Neither of us are. I can't go back to that life, to that love. I wish I could give you what you're looking for, but I'm not that man anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I had known, deep down, that this would be the outcome. Even though he remembered, even though the connection was still there, we were different people now. We had lived different lives, and the love we had once shared couldn't simply be revived. I understand, I whispered, my voice trembling. I've known for a while now that what we had is gone, and that's okay. I don't regret loving you, Zane, not in this life or the last. He stepped closer, reaching out to take my hand in his. His touch was warm, comforting, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the love I had once longed for, but it was something else, something deeper, something that came from a place of mutual respect and understanding. I don't regret it either, he said softly, but we've both moved on, and that's how it should be. For a long moment, we stood there in the quiet room, our hands clasped, neither of us needing to say anything more. The weight of the past had finally been lifted, and though there was sadness in letting go, there was also relief. Finally, Zane gave my hand a gentle squeeze before stepping back. Take care, Lyra, he said, his voice filled with a quiet finality. You deserve happiness. Don't let the past hold you back from finding it. I nodded, watching as he turned and walked away, just as he had that first day when we'd reunited in this life. But this time, there was no ache, no desperate need to follow him. This time, I let him go. The next few days passed in a blur. There was a strange sense of closure that followed Zane's visit, a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, I truly felt free of the past, free of the pain, free to move forward with my life. I still thought about him. Of course, Zane would always be a part of me, just as our past life would always be a part of my story, but I no longer clung to it, no longer yearned for something that could never be. Instead, I focused on the future. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, I sat all day by the window of my cottage, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope.